it's hard to believe that it's almost 175 years since the Battle of San Jacinto. And you stop and think about that battle and the Revolution being one of the things that just makes us so uniquely Texans, and just that defiant nature that we have by nature as being Texans. The Texas Revolution also gave us a number of icons that are still being used all across America today. As a matter of fact, the Daughters of the Republic are in the process of trying to trademark the phrase "the Alamo." This flag with the cannon at Gonzales, where the revolution started, that "come and take it" slogan, I mean, that was a defiant in nature, a Texas saying that was born at the beginning of the revolution. And then toward the end of the revolution, we've got another phrase that was put into use that's still being used today, which of course is "Remember the Alamo." Well, as you know, the "Remember the Alamo" slogan did not come about until about 6 weeks after the fall of the Alamo at San Jacinto. So at the fall of the Alamo, that was not uttered again until after the campaign about came to its close. And we have Sam Houston and Thomas Rusk at Harrisburg on the Buffalo Bayou on the banks there before the Texas Army crosses, giving motivational speeches. And so Sam Houston is giving a speech, and he says, "The Army will cross and we will meet the enemy. Some of us may be killed and must be killed." And he concluded his speech by telling the men there to remember the Alamo, and others added, "Remember Goliad" as well. So that was where that phrase really came into being. Now, of course, the campaign was already 6 weeks old at this point before the actual battle started down there at San Jacinto. Houston himself had been criticized largely by a number of his men for his perceived unwillingness to engage the Mexican army and to fight them along the course of all those weeks of marching. As of March 13th in Gonzales, he ordered the army to fall back after the word came of the fall of the Alamo, and the men began retreating from Gonzales. On that date, he had 374 men by the count that they did that date, which of course was not nearly enough to make a stand against the superior numbers of the Mexican army. Companies came to join him along the course of the march all the way back to the Colorado River, and by March 21st, the men numbered 810. So the numbers continued to grow as people came in from East Texas, Southern Texas, settlements all across the country. Literally outside of the country, men came in, U.S. volunteers that were recruited, as well as the local Texans. During the course of the next week, the number grew to 1,000 men by the time he got to March 26th, and yet Sam Houston was still reluctant to engage the enemy and continued to fall back. Now, why did I get interested in San Jacinto in the first place? I had two ancestors, two great-great-grandfathers that fought there, so that was a natural interest as a kid. And of course, being born in Houston and growing up there, that's my triple great-grandfather, Sadler. He goes way back in Texas. He had originally scouted land here in the 1820s and decided he would come back in the 1830s. He sold his farm in Georgia, decided he would move there permanently and live. Now, when he sets out, he makes it to the Alabama River and gets aboard a steamboat, and he meets another fellow there by the name of Marabou Lamar. Turns out that they are distantly related in marriage, and they get to know each other quite well and become friends traveling on the riverboat. And along the course of the journey, Lamar keeps a diary of all of his travels to Texas, about a 200-page diary, and he mentions my ancestor by name and talks about some of their conversations. They end up traveling by stagecoach, steamboat, horseback, and they make it to Natchitoches, Louisiana before Lamar becomes seriously ill and gets sidelined from his journey. Well, Sadler continues on and makes it to Natchitoches, and there he acquires the rights to the land in the area that he was fond of, which is present Anderson County, originally Houston County. And he got his land rights and set out with a handful of other settlers to go out there and to carve out a new settlement. Now, the land there, they called the city Houston. That was the original city of Houston, near where Palestine is. And it became the Fort Houston settlement. Well, once the revolution got going, there was a need for rangers, and the provisional government set about creating ranging districts. Garrison Greenwood, one of the other settlers that was the first to settle there, became the regional superintendent of that area, and he put Sadler in charge of the company there. So as of January 1st, 1836, Sadler was in command of 10 rangers at Fort Houston. They spent the next weeks working on the fortification, continuing to build Fort Houston, until they get word of the fall of the Alamo. That was somewhere around the middle of the month because they immediately set out, and the majority of the Ranger Company headed for Sam Houston's army to try to join to take on the Mexican army. See if we can go to the next slide. Now, it's probably a little known fact. A lot of the history books don't cover a lot about the Rangers in that period of time, which is part of what got me interested in doing the Savage Frontier series. But truth be told, there were 16 different companies of Texas Rangers that served at various times and for various lengths during the course of the Texas Revolution. So between October 1835 and April 1836, by best count, you've got between 350 and 400 men that served in the ranging companies of Texas. You know, one of the better known ones, of course, that we've heard about is Captain John Tumlinson's company, which was up in the Austin area. One of Tumlinson's Rangers, Noah Smithwick, wrote some memoirs that have been published for years, and he gives a pretty good account of what they did and how they helped the settlers during the runaway scrape. Another of the Ranger companies that's fairly well known was that of Lieutenant George Kimball, who organized the Gonzales Mounted Company. They, of course, ride into the Alamo at the end of February, the beginning of March, and the majority of those men do not make it out. They're, of course, lost when the Alamo falls. So those are two of the better known 16 companies. So it was a lot of work to dig in and try to get the research of all these other companies that served for various periods of time, including Captain Robertson, a company formed around this neck of the woods. But of these 16 companies, at least 10 of them were still in service by mid-March of 1836. And of the 350 or so men that served as Rangers during the Revolution, by my best count, at least 83 of those men either fought at the Battle of San Jacinto or were stationed at Harrisburg to guard the baggage or to help take care of the sick troops there. So I just wanted to pay some tribute to those guys, and that was part of the reason for doing some of that research. Obviously there was little need to defend the frontiers against Indians when you've got the whole Mexican army marching across Texas. So a lot of them moved to the army and joined. But as I studied that, I found a pretty fluid movement between joining the army service and then getting right back out and into the Ranger or Frontier service again once the Revolution was over. It was obviously a very unpopular move for the Rangers to be called upon in a lot of cases to guard the baggage at Harrisburg. I suppose Sam Houston may have found them to be easy targets since they were less formally organized and kind of a ragtag bunch. And so a couple of entire companies were part of the baggage guard. But you see Ranger captains and officers move into the cavalry as mere privates, losing their role just to serve, to fight, versus being kept behind as baggage guards. So it goes to show how unpopular that move was. In addition to Rangers, you also had Goliad Massacre survivors. Now, of course, when this happens, Colonel Fannon's men are marched outside of Goliad, and about 400 men are put to death by a firing squad at the orders of Santa Anna. Now, out of those men, only 29 survived by running for their lives and swimming across the river there and fleeing through the forest. Of those survivors, 6 of them made their way to the Texas Army, and they reached Sam Houston's camp. And of course, the stories they tell give the men there a lot more reason to not only remember the Alamo, but also remember Goliad. One of the men that survived was named Charles Shane, and he wrote home to his father about revenge being on his mind. He said, "I will try to avenge the death of some of my brave friends. All of my company were killed." Another Goliad survivor named David Jones joined Captain Hill's Washington County Company, and he gave those men further inspiration to remember Goliad. The Texas Army was on the move for most of the campaign. By March 26th, they, of course, had crossed over, and they moved to the Brazos River area and then up toward Gross's plantation, where they stayed for about 3 weeks till about April 10th. They did a lot of training during that time, trying to get organized, and of course, trying to wait for more men to join the Army. Now, during this time, Houston's taking flack not only from his men, but from some of the Texas government. President David Burnett sends him a note on April 10th, imploring him to fight, in which he says, "The enemy are laughing you to scorn. You must fight them. You must retreat no further. The country expects you to fight. The salvation of the country depends on your doing so." Now, ironically, as President Burnett is sending these sharp stingers to Houston to get him moving, one of his own cabinet members, Secretary of State Samuel Carson, is hoping to get General Gaines's Louisiana troops, U.S. troops, involved in the revolution. He's trying to show that if they can cross the border, They could do so legally by seeing that the Mexican army had incited the local Indians to raise up in hostility against the settlers. And if that was the case, the U.S. troops could be brought in to help out with the action against the Mexican army. So Carson writes to Houston, and he's hoping to draw these thousands of U.S. troops into the battle. He sends Houston a letter on April 14th, just 1 week before the San Jacinto battle, and he says, "You must fall back and hold out, and let nothing goad or provoke you to a battle, unless you can, without a doubt, whip them, or unless you are compelled to fight. You should fall back, if necessary, to the Sabine." So now Houston's got a twofold risk. Should he listen to Carson and wait to see if U.S. troops come into it, or is he going to lose the rest of his men in the course of the march as they just disintegrate and head back to their homes? Well, of course, there's the famous fork in the road, and they reached that turning point on April 16th, just 2 days after Carson's note comes into Houston. And of course, one path is going to lead further toward the United States and the Sabine, and the other path leads down toward the Gulf Coast. Well, as we know, Houston and his men take the path toward battle, head that way, and choose not to retreat, not to wait for the U.S. troops. Well, I thought for today we'd spend a little bit of the time talking about those pivotal 18 minutes of the Battle of San Jacinto and some of the men, some of the heroes that helped achieve that stunning victory. Now, on April 19th, they cross Buffalo Bayou. The Texas Army crosses the water there and heads over to engage the Mexican troops. And the next day, there's a skirmish. The Mexican advanced their cannon, which is called the Golden Standard, out onto the battlefield. And there's some firing back and forth. And Sidney Sherman leads a group of about 70 cavalrymen, volunteers, to go out there and try to seize that cannon. Well, they're unsuccessful. They do manage to kill about 20 Mexican soldiers in the process, and to that, about 4 Texans are wounded. But it's pretty much, it's just a minor skirmish because Houston refuses to let the full army engage at that point. There were also some close escapes, as we see here. A young cavalryman named Walter Lane is out skirmishing against the Mexican cavalrymen, and he's knocked from his horse. One of the men that comes out to help rescue him is Mirabeau Lamar, along with Henry Carnes. And for his bravery in the skirmish on the 20th, Lamar is promoted from a private up into a senior officer's commanding role for the next day's battle. Now, just a little bit of trivia and statistics. There's about 255 Texans left behind at Harrisburg, either sick or guarding the baggage. And then for the battle itself, best count I can put together is 930 Texans present. You read all kinds of different numbers, but that's the total number that I can ascertain that were there. Taking on 1,300 or more Mexican soldiers, depending on which accounts you read. Now, those 930 Texans who did fight at San Jacinto, kind of a mixed bag of people as far as what they wore and what they had for armament. No real true uniforms, with few exceptions. Most people wearing buckskin, moccasins, fur caps, even some guys wearing sombreros. As far as Sam Houston, he wore a broad cap. He had a Cherokee coat, a buckskin vest, and some silver-spurred riding boots. Only one of the companies, Captain William Wood's company from Kentucky, had been formally outfitted by Sidney Sherman, and so they wore uniforms, and only 2 of the Texan officers, Colonel Sherman and Colonel John Wharton, being the only 2 with true officer uniforms. In terms of size, the largest company for the Texans was 59 men. That was Captain Mosley Baker's San Felipe Company. The smallest was Captain Alfred Wiley's 14-man unit. 60% of the Texans were single. The median age of the troops was 28 years old. Most of them were from southern states, with about 19% coming from northern states, and only 5% of the people fighting there being born in foreign countries. Most, of course, were Caucasian, but there were at least 5 African Americans there for the Battle of San Jacinto, and 29 Tejanos, most of which were under Captain Juan Seguin's company. Some of these were either in the battle itself or guarding the baggage at Harrisburg. But regardless, this brave lot of men, what they managed to accomplish is just stunning in terms of a victory, killing at least 600 of their opponents and capturing 600 to 700 more of them in just a short period of time. Okay. Now, on April 21st, after they've had the skirmish the first day, Houston calls for a council of war at noon, pulls his senior officers together to decide, what do you want to do? Do you want to march in and attack the Mexican army, or do you want to wait for them to attack us? Now, out of all these men that have been criticizing him all this time, their representatives vote 2-1. Let's don't attack. Let's don't fight. Let's just wait. Let's see if Santa Anna will come attack us. Now, if by late in the day they don't make a move, we'll go ahead and make our move. So it's kind of ironic, after all the heat Houston's taken, that they opt not to march in and fight right away. But during this time, as we know, Deaf Smith leads a small party out there, and they destroy the only means into the battlefield across Vence's Bayou, tear down the bridge. By about 3 o'clock, it becomes evident the Mexican army is not going to move across the field and engage the Texans. So Houston parades his troops, calls the men together, and asks them what they want to do. And every captain to a man says, "Our men are ready to fight, let's go." And so they start moving out. The drummers tap out general parade, and they silently start moving forward with the cavalry to one side and the artillery pieces being advanced. Now, one of the little controversies about the Battle of San Jacinto is if they went into battle with music playing at the time as they marched across the field. Reality is music didn't start until after the first shots were fired. In the words of Private John Menifee, he claimed that the troops, quote, "marched upon the enemy with the stillness of death. No fife, no drums, no voice was heard until at 200 yards distance." Captain Robert Calder also agreed with that statement, saying that the Texans initially advanced in, quote, "almost perfect silence." So how did the Texans, we can advance, how did they achieve the element of surprise? Well, as most of us know, you've got several things working in their favor. You've got the tall prairie grass there. You've got a slight rise in the hill. In the Mexican camp, you've also got General Cose's 400 reinforcements who have arrived late that morning. Now, during the noon hour, one of Cose's captains asked Santa Anna if they can water the horses and let them feed and graze, and if the men can rest, because they've been on the march with no food or water or rest for more than 24 hours. Well, Santa Anna agrees to that and lets the men take a break there. In addition, one of his officers, Colonel Pedro Delgado, criticized His Excellency for his choice of campground area. And he says, "The camping ground of His Excellency's selection was, in all respects, against military rules. Any youngster would have done better. We had the enemy on our right within a wood at long musket range. Our front, although level, was exposed to the fire of the enemy. Retreat was easy for him to his right or to his rear, while our own troops had no space for maneuvering. What ground had we to retreat on in case of an emergency? From sad experience, I answer none." Now, I've been in contact with Dr. Greg Dimick over a number of years. He, of course, did the book called Sea of Mud, The Retreat of the Mexican Army. He shared a few papers that he got from some of the Mexican POWs or prisoners after the Battle of San Jacinto when they were interrogated, and he kind of did his own translation. So I just thought I'd read a couple of statements made by a couple of these guys that I wish I'd have had at the time. I wrote 18 minutes, but I thought it was pretty interesting. One of these was Toribio Reyes, who was a private of the Grenadier Company from the Matamoros Battalion, and he describes the laxness that prevailed in the Mexican camp at the time of the battle. "The President commanded at about 10 in the morning that the horses of all the officers be saddled for the Grenadiers to ride, and accompany him with a picket of cavalry to explore the enemy camp. Having done so, he and his troops retired and ordered them to unsaddle and feed the horses. At about noon, General Don Martin Cos arrived with the Aldama and Guerrero battalions. They placed himself at the rear guard of the column and formed a stack of arms. Immediately, the President ordered a pound of flour per garrison to make tortilla and take mess. So as the Texans are approaching, they're either sleeping or starting to make lunch. Another of the Mexican statements from Corporal Juan Reyes talks about the initial panic and flight of Santa Anna. He says, "The President retired to his hut to rest. About 3 p.m., the enemy fell upon us with such violence that when the bugle of the right flank signaled the enemy on that side, it was lost in the din of battle. At that moment, the President appeared, berating the Guerrero and Aldama battalions, which had already abandoned the field of battle and retreated to the rear guard. This prevented those troops from advancing on the enemy. The President was screaming for a horse, but could not obtain one because the noise of the firing had caused our horses to flee." So these are eyewitness statements just given a couple of weeks after the battle there. That, of course, is the battleground illustration where you can see how the Mexican army was deployed and the Texan army. The Texans, of course, advance across the battlefield using the cover of the woods and the tall grass to their advantage. Sidney Sherman's troops moving through the mossy oaks and being among the first to make it into the campground there. Santa Anna was in his tent at that time, either sleeping, as he later claimed, or possibly paying attention to Miss Emily West, whichever account you choose to believe. The 17-year-old Emily was an indentured servant who had been captured 2 days before at Colonel Morgan's plantation. She was a mulatto girl who some claimed to be the inspiration for the song The Yellow Rose of Texas. In any event, whatever was happening, the element of surprise was complete. The Mexican army was completely overtaken. Sherman's division had the Mexican campground in complete disarray and on the run within 18 minutes. Shouts of "Remember the Alamo" ring out as the muskets and the pistols and the cannons opened fire. And surprisingly, the Texans took very few casualties in the early moments of the battle. Private Joseph Lawrence described the opening fire as we advanced, they did not see us until we were within 100 yards of them. They fired a terrific volley of small shot at us, but fortunately they shot over our heads. It seemed at once if anyone had put their hat 2 feet above his head, he could have caught 20 bullets or more. Now, although the Mexican gunfire was initially high, they soon adjusted their aim, and the Texans began to take some casualties. Sergeant Moses Austin Bryan, who was a nephew of Stephen F. Austin, related, "I had 3 holes shot in the skirts of my frock coat as we advanced in a trot, and I heard bullets whistling as they overshot us." The twin sisters' cannon roared in support of the Texans. "Every man sprang forward with renewed energy," said John Swisher. "The thunder of their roar is very potent in scaring the wits out of the enemy." He also wrote that during the retreat, the air seemed to be full of hissing bullets. This, of course, is the famous McArdle painting of the Battle of San Jacinto. And again, quoting from one of the Mexican soldiers captured at the battle, he talks about the loss of order. He says, "The rest of my division opened fire without much order because neither the voice of the president or any commander was able to maintain order in the companies of the Grenadier until the voice of the officer of Toluca was heard. He sent his company to open fire and withdrawal, and at the voice of this officer, all the troops retreated without any order, each one looking for some way to escape until they came upon a ditch which impeded their path. They threw themselves in a ditch, and in doing so, they disabled their weapons and ammunition because the water was up to their chests. They started throwing away their arms and entered the woods to see how they could escape." So those that did not flee really didn't have a chance. They were cut down on the field. It became hand-to-hand combat in a lot of cases. Broken rifle butts, knives, literally hand-to-hand action in a lot of cases. Private John Hassel wrote home to his father about his own handiwork with his prized rifle, Betsy. He said, "I shot old Betsy 6 times and a holstered pistol 1 time, and I know that I got 4 of them." And in the midst of the campground, General Manuel Castrillon was one of the few that stood valiantly and tried to coax the Mexicans to stay and fight and keep taking on the Texans. He stood beside the Golden Standard cannons, imploring his men to keep fighting, but as Thomas Rusk witnessed, Castrillon was literally cut down just by a fusillade, just a torrent of bullets took him down. Rusk wrote, "In 10 minutes after the firing of the first gun, we were charging through the camp and driving them before us." Private Charles Shane, one of those 6 Goliad survivors I mentioned, wrote that our whole army was across the breastwork in 15 or 20 minutes after the battle commenced. General Houston's official report stated that it was, quote, "about 18 minutes from the time of close action until his army had officially put the Mexican army on the run." Although greatly outnumbered, the Texans had accomplished the unthinkable in just a little over a quarter of an hour. One of the soldiers wrote home to his folks that achieving such a crushing victory in a mere 18 minutes, quote, "at once shows that the hand of Providence was with us." And although the Mexican army was whipped in a short period of time, the battle would go on for another 2 hours, although most of that was really just a massacre at that point. Santa Anna is on the run. One of his officers remarked that his men had become a bewildered and panic-stricken herd. He made it to the bayou, but his own fear of water would eventually lead to his capture because he would not swim across the bayou. So we'll come back to him in a minute. Now, during the heat of the battle, there was another controversial event that came up, And people say that Sam Houston tried to call a halt to the troops to try to put an end to the battle. Rusk at that point yelled to the troops, "Don't stop, go ahead, give them hell." But Houston would later say he was not trying to stop the troops or call a halt, but he was merely trying to get one of the regular company's attention to send them back to camp to guard some of the prisoners there. In any event, no one paid heed to that, because as Captain Robert Calder would later say, "I very much doubt if any captain could, at short notice, have formed any 5 of his men together." The Mexican cannon, of course, is overrun at this point, and those men are killed, and the remainder of the men have fled from the camp, and they fall back toward Peggys Lake. Now, on the next slide here, this surrender painting, this leads to another controversy of San Jacinto, and that's if Sam Houston was shot by his own troops or if he was shot by the Mexican army. The Washington County Company was near Houston at the time he was shot down, and Captain Robert Stevenson wrote 2 days after the battle that General Houston had 2 horses killed under him and was shot through the leg. Now, at the time, he was riding across the field heading to the right, which would have exposed his left side to the Mexican army. Now, because of a rumor that he may have been shot by Texas, one of the own Texas troops, some historians have speculated on where he was shot, which leg. And of course, this famous painting by Huddle, William Henry Huddle from 1886, shows a bandaged right leg, which would have been away from the Mexican army, the way he rode across the field. But digging a little deeper, we find out that it was actually his left leg that was shot at San Jacinto, the one facing the Mexican army. This is supported by the fact from his son, who wrote that his father's, quote, left ankle was shattered by a copper ball. And Sam Houston himself wrote in 1853 to his wife, "I still suffer in my left leg from the same cause that I complained about, the San Jacinto wound." So that pretty clearly points to the left leg facing the Mexican army. Another controversial thing about the battle was Colonel John Forbes reportedly killing a Mexican woman. This was down toward Peggys Lake in the waning moments of the battle. Some of the soldiers came across a Mexican man and a woman, which they didn't originally understand to be a woman from the way she was dressed. A couple of the soldiers killed the Mexican man quickly, and then Forbes ran her through with a sword and killed her. Now, of course, around the camp, he took a lot of heat from this, but when he was put before some of his fellow Texas officers a couple days later, they cleared him of any wrongdoing, but it didn't stop the Texan soldiers from having a lot of fun at his expense. So around the camp, they'd call out, "Who killed the woman?" And someone would call out from the other side of the camp, "Colonel Forbes done it." And then he would take some humiliation from something else that happened on April 20th, the day before. A report came in that the Mexican army was approaching fast on horseback, and he ran to jump on a mule to flee, not realizing that its legs were hobbled and it was secured to the ground. Couldn't quite get away. So when they're doing these shouts across the campfire, they'd also holler out, "Who jumped on the hobbled mule?" And somebody'd yell back, "Colonel Forbes done it." So he became a laughingstock for a while there, but at the expense of what he had done there that was inexcusable. Now, at the Peggys Lake, that really became a slaughter ground or a revenge ground for the Texans. They'd lost friends and family members at the Alamo and at Goliad, where Santa Anna spared no one. And the Texans, in turn, returned the favor here and spared no one until late in the day when any kind of order could be restored. The Texans pursued them, hopping across fallen horses and bodies into the swamps and into the bogs, and they shot them. According to Walter Lane, he said the Mexicans took to the water like ducks to swim across, our men firing at their heads. They used their knives, their rifle butts, and anything they could to get their revenge. And as the Mexican soldiers cried, "Me no Goliad, me no Alamo," in return they got cries of "Remember the Alamo," and there was no mercy shown at that point. One of the soldiers, named Alan Carruthers, he'd lost a brother who was executed by the Mexican army at Goliad. He continued shooting even at that stage in the swamp, killing at least 5 Mexicans as they tried to surrender. His own son would consider his dad's actions to be nothing short of murder at that point, but he explained his actions to his son, saying, "I was just crazed with anger," which was a common feeling among the Texans that day. Cavalryman Billy Young was another one at that point. He had been shot early in the battle and wounded, but at Peggys Lake, he also took revenge the same way. He wrote, "We drove him into a marsh. I shot him until my ammunition gave out. Then I turned the butt end of my musket and knocked him in the head. Finally, some of the Texans were able to restore some order after 2 to 2.5 hours of fighting. Houston had by that time tried to call the battle off and try to get his men to stop fighting after the earlier controversial first halt. But when he tried to get the men in order to retreat back to the camp and form up, he couldn't get anybody to listen. And he finally heard, one of the participants heard Houston remark as he was riding back, "Men, I can gain victories with you, but damn your manners." So he was even appalled at the massacre that was going on there. Now, when the battle ended, there were at least 600 Mexican soldiers killed and approximately 730 that had been taken prisoner. They were herded up and guarded around the campfire with the artillery pieces pointing at them. And the next day, Santa Anna himself was rounded up and brought back into the camp. Now, when he's brought back in, the scouts that captured him didn't realize at first who they had until they brought him back to the prisoner pen, and some of the soldiers started standing up saying, "El Presidente, El Presidente." The officers were quick to say, "Shut up," but it didn't work. He'd already been given up, so he did announce who he was, and he was, of course, taken before Sam Houston. Incidentally, my ancestor Sadler that I mentioned, according to the stories I've had passed down, he was the one that walked up and tore open his private's jacket to reveal the fine linen studded shirt that was underneath of His Excellency's more famous fine linens. Now, according to some of these statements that Greg Dimmick got from some of the Mexican soldiers, they agree that the Texans didn't have any idea who they'd captured initially. Corporal Reyes testified, "Two enemies arrived escorting the senior president. They were delivering him to the guard that was in charge of all the prisoners. The guard asked the president, 'Where is your general?' The prisoners then answered that he was right in front of them. And at this, Santa Anna finally told them that to take him with them. Placing his hand on his chest, he said, 'I am Santa Anna.' The enemy had scarcely heard this discovery when they began to manifest the greatest jubilation, throwing their hats high, congratulating one another, playing reveille with 2 drums and a little whistle, all the instruments that they had." And another, one of the Mexicans agreed that it was a stunning victory at San Jacinto when he says, "The forces of the enemy had no organization and were not separated by companies or battalion, nor were they in any uniform. They were composed of countrymen that were recruited from the vagrants and the drunks by means of commissioners who offered 30 or 40 pesos for marching to Texas." Now, Reyes' reference to the Texans being drunks may have come from what happened as they were standing there as prisoners of war overnight, watching the Texans celebrate. Part of the spoils of war that they had found was a big stash of bottles of champagne. 2 of the Texans were told to guard the goods and that they could pass out edibles to the troops who were hungry that night. Well, George Erath, one of the fellow guards, said that his other guard, William Simmons, loosely interpreted champagne to also be edible, so that was passed out. And he said he gave the bottles away, quote, "liberally to the stragglers returning to camp," saying we had permission to give it away. All right, so as Santa Anna is brought before Sam Houston, fortunately Sam Houston has the presence of mind to use him as an important pawn piece and keep him alive, although most of the Texans were in favor of putting him to death on the spot. So Texas was able to earn its independence by keeping Santa Anna alive and forced the rest of the Mexican army to retreat out of Texas back into Mexico. Acting Captain Robert Stevenson, who had led the Washington County Company at San Jacinto, wrote 2 days after the battle what I think is a pretty good summary. "Never was there a greater victory according to the number of men engaged, and the results are glorious for the Army and for the prospects of Texas." Now, of course, thankfully, San Jacinto is still alive today every year with the reenactment that goes on in April. I know a lot of you have been there, participated in it, and love to see that. I like to stay involved with it, and I encourage any youngsters that haven't been to take them out and have them watch that in April. Obviously, with 175 years, it's a historic event coming up this coming year. So if we can move on. At this point, I just want to show you a little bit. I can skip ahead a couple more. Kind of recovering history, some of what I've also enjoyed doing over the years. This, of course, being the monument out there. On these battlegrounds, I've helped work with Texas Parks and Wildlife officials and with the archaeologists to recover relics and artifacts from the battle. I know there's, a pretty good group of people that do this on a regular basis, and it's important to be able to preserve these relics. I, of course, get a sense of satisfaction of seeing them come out of the ground, wondering, could one of my two ancestors have shot this rifle ball or this musket ball back in 1836? And just seeing anything come up from the ground that's literally been there since the day it happened is kind of exciting to me. This shot was taken a couple years back. I enjoy working with metal detectors to recover history, be it Civil War or Texas Revolution or whatever it might be. So working with Greg Dimmick's group and with the coordination of Texas Parks and Wildlife, this was actually on NRG Energy's property, just a mile or so from the battlefield. This is supposedly where the retreat took place and where a lot of the Mexican soldiers surrendered late that night. They have found stacks of bayonets buried there. If we can go to the next slide. Groups of musket balls. That one group there, one of the girls is holding a stack. I pinpointed 13 or 14 musket balls in a group, which was probably a bag of dropped shot, probably as they're shedding their armament and surrendering at that point. So you learned a lot by what you find and where you find it and what condition it's in. The bottom left, that's either a harness ring or possibly a bayonet ring. In the middle is another musket ball. And the far right over there in the bag is probably was a shot pouch buckle where their shot would have come out of the pouch there. And as you can see, the archaeologists that are there, after we pinpoint it and detect it, they dig it, recover it, they record the date, the lane, they get the GPS coordinates, they get all the data necessary to map this on old maps, current maps, finds from 5 years ago, from last week, and they can tell a lot about what happened. This was June of last year. I put together a team to go down there in conjunction with Texas Parks and Wildlife. I think we had 10 or 12 detectorists, plus an equal number of diggers and stewards that recover the artifacts, and then some of the Texas Parks and Wildlife people, as well as the Friends of San Jacinto. These are a few of the artifacts coming out of the ground that's within sight of the monument. We're literally near the Mexican breastworks digging this day, pulling up musket balls and various artifacts. Charles Garrett up there, founder of Garrett Electronics, he's having a ball just like a kid again out there digging up a Mexican musket ball near the camp. In the upper left, that is a canister plate. What would have been fired from a cannon, a collection of grape shot or canister balls that would scatter out and do a large amount of damage. They've only found 3 of those so far, and they tell me that's from the Texas cannon. They know why, and they're compiling all this data, but that being only the 3rd one of the canister plates they found, that was significant to the archaeologists. Again, showing movement of where cannons were fired and where events happened versus where it's said to have happened. The upper right up there is a flat button that would have been worn on a uniform, and the bottom corner down there is a folding knife that may have been lost by one of the participants. I think I recovered that one 100 yards or so from where the Mexican breastworks were. So I would probably venture to guess it was a Texan knife, somebody that fell or lost it in the course of the battle there. This just illustrates how some of the process works on recovering artifacts with the archaeologists. Upper corner pinpointing a target, and then the detectorist there, he's taking a break as she does the survey back to the site station, and they record the exact precise measurements, distance, depth, and everything else of where the thing is found. And then it's what I call tagged and bagged. It's put into these preservation bags with all the data recorded. Those are spikes and iron square nails from what would have been the breastworks where the Mexicans built up their pack saddles and boxes to make their defensive breastworks. And after all that rots and disintegrates, you've still got the iron pieces left over in the ground. And just another one, I know a few of you had interest in the Rangers and the Texas Indian Wars. I've also done some work this past couple of years in East Texas near Tyler, the 1839 Cherokee War, or the Battle of the Natchez. I've gone out there and talked with them a couple times at their July reunions, and it goes back 10 years or more, probably first going to that property as I was writing that first Savage Frontier book. But Eagle Douglas and some of the ones that have acquired the land, the American Indian Cultural Society, I said, if we can come out there and detect and find some things, we'll donate it to you guys, since I know you want to put a museum here one day. And they agreed to let us do it. We hunted the entire land and didn't find anything from that period. So I went back to the research and went back to the maps, and I dug deeper, and I decided it was a couple hundred yards the other way, basically on somebody else's property. A hill similar to the hill they thought was the Indian Village Hill, but it turned out to be a different one. This is one of the small groups. I led several different expeditions out there to work and find things, and we did eventually find our first musket ball, and then came back and really got on the hot area of where the heaviest action was. Found some of the what they call bullet buttons. That was an early 1830s style vest button or coat button. And there's a few artifacts being dug up there. So I was happy to help pinpoint that area and figure out where the Indian village was, which is literally on the adjacent land where they plowed up arrowheads and pottery over the years. And I believe in responsible relic recovery. And so where I can, I like to give things back. So in this case, even though I didn't find it on their land, I held my promise and gave Eagle Douglas and the folks working there with the Cherokee land an artifact case, some of the donated arrowheads from the landowners, and then some of the musket balls and artifacts that we found. And then also figured it was fair to give something to the other side, if you will. So donated some to the Texas Ranger Museum. That's a couple of the captains and one of the lieutenants from the companies that came down, and they took that case back, and I'm told it's has been on display up in Waco in the Ranger Museum. So that's just a little bit kind of a sidebar away from San Jacinto, but either place I enjoy looking for Texas history, researching it, writing it. I hope that what we do in a small part will be appreciated by some of the younger generation. Not only can they read about it, but also they can see things like this and experience it firsthand, things that have come out of the ground. So I guess at this point I'll open it up while we got a little time and take a few questions.